welcome y'all. Some of you have been attending for the last few weeks, and of course, as a result of that is why we're talking about strawberries tonight, because this one, by and large, was the one everybody selected out of, I don't know, the first Monday night we had like 30 different topics, and this was the winner there, and then it was the winner last week. So I figured we just needed to roll out with strawberries. I was telling Mary before everybody else got on here that this is the first time we have used this presentation. This was created by the Home Fruit and Veggie Group statewide, so we've got about 3 of us that have worked on this. So we've got some spelling errors, we've got some as far as the spacing, some of those type issues going on. We haven't had time to go in there and change it, but y'all are the first to see this. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share this with y'all tonight after class in PDF, and then of course with the video. But then when we complete this, I will go in there and delete this one and replace with the new one. So get out your little notes and make notes, or pencils and make notes of any kind of grammatical things or things that you see that might be wrong in here, because I haven't had time to really go in there and edit it before tonight. So we welcome your feedback. But anyway, welcome to, you see there, session 5. We're doing this out of order, of course, but we're just going to spend about 35-40 minutes on strawberries and hopefully give you a little introduction as to how to be the most productive, increase your yields, things you need to do beforehand to be successful with this crop. So the cool thing about strawberries, of course, is that they're small. They're going to take up a lot less space. That second bullet point there, fastest fruit to harvest, that's usually what gets most folks, because they want to plant something and having, immediately have fruit growing. It's pretty much low input when we compare it to other crops, especially those we talked about last week. And then of course flavor, who doesn't love strawberries? So just today we're going to talk about a production overview. We're going to talk about some types, different types, and cultivar selection. We're going to talk about preparation and planting tips, and of course how to renovate and manage the strawberries, so hopefully you can be picking for years to come off of one crop. And then a little bit on disease and pest management, but I think we covered most of that last week. And some of you remember this picture because this is what we think about when we think about growing strawberries in the backyard. We want to be able to go out there and pick our own, and it is pretty simple to do that, especially if we're growing in raised beds. So as far as just a brief overview, we've got a couple of different kinds that we can grow successfully here in Northeast Tennessee. We have the short day, which are going to bloom, or you're going to be fruiting in May and June, and then we have the Everbearing or the day neutral, and you can pull a crop off of those pretty much throughout the season, starting into spring and go all the way into late summer. And you'll see there that first crop is going to be produced in about 8 to 12 months on the short day. It can be a little bit less for some of those everbears. And this is one that we don't really encourage you, like blueberries, to go be pinching the blooms and stuff off. Once you plant these, you're going to be harvesting fruit and be able to enjoy those as the season moves along. Now, as far as location, of course, drainage is going to be critical. You've had a really good test in the last 24 hours to determine if you have a good location for strawberries, because anywhere that there's water still standing is not where you want to be planting strawberries this year. As far as soil pH, right there with where our traditional veggie gardens are going to be at a 6 to 6.5. Strawberries do prefer that deep, rich soil. We want to have a good organic matter base. So if we got that red clay, you might want to spend a couple years in building your soil health, building the tilth of that soil. Maybe grow in raised beds for a couple years till you get the soil where you want it to be. Because you'll notice there, the heavier or the clayier that soil is, the more disease issues can be incurred. So just be conscientious of that as you move forward. The other thing, I kind of alluded to this last week, you want to plant where you have not planted strawberries before, or some of the other solanaceous crops, because of the cross of disease, verticillium wilt being the biggest one. So just be really careful with that, really incorporate that crop rotation program You don't want to go time after time with any crop, but especially strawberries. And don't follow strawberries or tomatoes with strawberries, peppers, and things like that. Just remember that. And strawberries are going to be more sensitive to salts, higher salt concentration than some of our other fruit crops, just because of the way their root system is. It's really shallow. They can, their roots can grab that salt a little bit more efficiently than some of our other fruit crops, and it can stunt back their growth. And that's going to be dependent on fertility. And we're going to spend some time talking about that in a little while, so hopefully you can prevent some of that from occurring. So just some specifics on strawberries. They are a herbaceous perennial plant. They are going to have that compressed stem and crown, and we're going to show you a picture of that in a little bit as to how to plant that to be most effective. They are going to have runners or stolons that are going to form when those days get longer and the temperatures get higher. And you can see there 10 hours of daylight or sunlight and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's why this time of year you see people with raised beds or a location in their garden, or they maybe have straw and they're going out during the day and raking that straw back, and then at night they're going and putting that straw back over them, because just helping to protect that bloom from any kind of freezing. Some wind and self-pollination does occur with strawberries. We've got some growers that think they can get away with that, but bees are going to be very critical for the pollination efforts of strawberries. And just a reminder that fruit is actually hundreds of seeds on that swollen receptacle. And strawberry, yes.
Does it make a difference if you use a pyramid?
No. No, I think I've actually got a picture of that in here somewhere too.
Okay.
That'll show you some different ways to plant in small space. Strawberries are going to be really shallow rooted. You're only going to plant those about 6 to 12 inches, depending on what type. And we'll get into that here, well, right now. So the types that we're going to be talking about tonight are going to be short day, everbearing, and day neutral. And oftentimes we'll interchangeably use everbearing and day neutral. There's a little bit of difference there. You're going to see what that is in just a minute, but probably the biggest difference for y'all to associate with, those big old berries that Scott's Farms are growing, those are going to be this first one, the short day or the June bearing. Those great big old berries. Those are typically what those are. They're going to fruit in the late spring, and then they're going to turn into their vegetative state during those long summer days, and then they're going to set those flower buds in the late summer into fall when the daylight hours start going down. Everbearing are going to be those longer day types. They're going to fruit in late spring and late summer, or even into early fall. This is the one I was talking about. You can pretty much pick all season long if the weather holds. You're going to have few runners or stolons, and oftentimes we're going to use runners and stolons interchangeably too, if you want to make a note of that. And then they're going to have multiple crowns. That's going to annoy some people. It just depends on what you prefer as a grower. If you prefer the runners and the stolons, or the mini crowns versus just one plant that puts out just a couple of runners. And I'll show you pictures of those in a minute. Day neutral, the reason that we throw this type in here is because it is the one type that's not controlled by that day length. So it doesn't matter for fruit or fruit bud initiation. It doesn't matter for harvesting, for ripening to harvest or anything. Those day neutrals are not going to be controlled by day length. They're going to fruit that first year, but they're going to be really small berries. So again, let's go back to those berries that you're purchasing at the produce stands from down along the Nolichucky. Those are great big berries, right? Sometimes 2 or 3 sizes the size of my thumb. A day neutral or an everbearer is going to be really teeny tiny. And again, it's just a matter of preference. I typically tend to think those day neutrals or everbearers are a little bit sweeter, but that's, again, just a matter of preference. The bad thing about those day neutral is because hot temperatures can disrupt the growth. So, we talk about this in a lot of fruit crops, that cool weather can stunt back the growth. Or if we go out and we set tomatoes in the soil up here last week, well, they're just going to sit there because the soil temperature is not where it needs to be. So we say that stunts that growth back from that tomato. Well, it's the opposite for a day neutral strawberry. If it gets too hot, it's just going to shock them. And again, that's one of those things we can't always predict with Mother Nature, but that's something to just be aware of. Now to go back to the short day cultivars, again, you're going to pull that one crop off in May, late May or June. Sometimes, depending on when those were planted, depending on the weather, we can, likely even harvest a little bit earlier, even into late April. I listed the varieties that we tend to think grow best here. Early Glow, that is resistant to red steel disease, and we'll talk about that toward the end of the presentation again. But Early Glow and All Star and let's see, Jewel are the three that we really recommend for Northeast Tennessee. But Early Glow, of course, it's going to ripen earlier. So this is another thing to kind of keep in mind if you're wanting to stagger your production or stagger your harvest. Then you could grow one of these early and then do a mid-season and then do a late season. So that way you would extend your harvest. But the Honeyoid, that's a early to mid fruit. It can become soft. Mite and disease susceptibility is really high with this, so they're going to perform a little bit better in cooler areas. Marys and Sullivan County, that may actually produce better there. Up along Roan Mountain, Carter County, Mountain City, this one performs very well in those cooler climatic conditions. All Star is going to be a mid-season variety. It's too is resistant to red steel, but the color is not going to be really dark. It's almost a pinkish color, like the color of the screen here. It's not that bright, vibrant red. And then the Cardinal, that's common in the Mid-South. You're going to see that variety grown throughout Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. So it does do well in those humid conditions. And then Cavendish is mid-season. It's also resistant to red steel, and it's also resistant to verticillium. So if you're going into an area that you've had tomatoes or strawberries planted before, like if you just bought property or something like that, Cavendish would be a good variety to start with in that regard. And then Jewel, that's just a good all-around performer. And Sparkle's an older late season, but again, it's going to have soft fruit. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about soft fruit? And again, this is going to be a matter of preference. If you like a firm berry to just eat on, then some of these softer fruit varieties are not going to be what you're looking for. Those softer fruit varieties tend to be what we're going to make jams and jellies out of, just as an FYI. Some people might actually prefer that softer fruit. But also the softer fruit with our humidity and the rain that we typically have this time of year can introduce disease pathogens, which can also lead to insect damage as well. So be careful with that. These are some short day cultivars that we use in the annual hill system or plasticulture. So again, this is going to be what the guys on the Nola Chucky are growing: the Sweet Charlies, the Camarosa, and the Chandlers. And they're typically going to be staggering those. So often what you're going to be getting this time of year, that first picking will usually be a Sweet Charlie. It's going to be a soft berry. It's going to have that good flavor, and it's got a pretty fair yield if you're a commercial grower or if you're growing for U-pick. The Chandler has always been the standard for that. And then Camarosa is going to be a later season, and farmers market folks like this because they can hold it a little bit longer. So if you're thinking about growing for some of those type markets and not just for the backyard, these are going to do better on that plasticulture versus the matted row. And we'll talk about those differences here in just a minute. NC State is currently in the process of releasing some new cultivars. We're going to have some of those in trials actually here in Greenville, if we can ever get out there and get them planted. We've got about 240 that need to go in the ground out there. So we're going to be evaluating some of those new cultivars. But a couple to mention, Rocco is an early season, and then Liz. That one's got a really large firm berry, and it's got a high yield and good flavor. So in trials so far, it's outperformed a lot of the even our Sweet Charlies and Chandlers. So we think that could be one that we're going to be looking to in the future. Everbearing Cultivars, Ozark Beauty is probably by far the most popular for this area. And again, these are those that you're going to be picking on throughout the season, or at least pulling a couple of crops off of. Day Neutral, these are what we typically refer to as just those improved Everbears. That's why you'll hear us often interchange day neutral again with Everbear, because they are so similar except for that day length. Albion is a medium large berry. It's got good flavor. It's firm. You're going to have to apply a higher nitrogen rate for this berry, and that's something we can talk about, like when you do a soil test and you go in with this specific variety. Of course, our soil lab can't determine that, but we'll always try to kick that up. So just keep that in mind if you are going to grow this specific variety. Tribute and TriStar, those are two you probably heard of quite frequently. TriStar especially, it tends to be a really tiny berry, but it's got pretty good flavor if you like a tartar berry. Both of those are going to be tolerant of leaf spot and scorch, red steel, verticillium, and powdery mildew. And you've heard me talk enough to know that the mildews can be a major problem throughout the season. And remember that day neutral is going to be setting forth that flush of fruit all season long. So we want to keep the mildews and the botrytis off of those as much as we can. So that's one reason we do recommend TriStar and Tribute for this area. And just to talk a little bit about pros and cons as far as the short day, and again, those short day, we're going back on the big plasticulture down by the river just to keep reminding you what the difference is there. But those crops are not going to be damaged by the hot summers. Those plants are going to reproduce well for ongoing production, and they're going to have that concentrated harvest period. The negative to that is that runners are not always going to be wanted. They're not going to be good for containers. So if you are going to think about growing in raised beds or the pyramid like Jenny was talking about, the wheels, the gutters, anything like that, you do not want one of these short day varieties. You want to go to one of the Everbears or the day neutrals. These are the ones that are going to have that winter and spring protection. Oftentimes they're going to use water in those big commercial systems. You've probably seen that where they'll actually freeze the bloom. I know it seems kind of paradoxical, but it does actually work. It prevents that from freezing and actually helps the fruit come on a little bit later. The other negative to these is just that disease issue. They're going to have a little bit higher disease pressure. Now, as far as the day neutral and the Everbears, you're going to get those multiple harvests, which a lot of folks love. You're going to have fresh eating throughout the season. You're going to have fewer runners. This is where you're going to want to incorporate the small space, the container type berry. This is what they're good for. You're going to have fruit just a month after you plant them typically, and you're not going to have to worry about any of that spring or winter damage. These do have a lower yield than the short day, and again, that yield is going to be impacted by hot, humid weather. There are going to be different aspects to selection of strawberry and growing systems. Those are going to go back to those S's we talked about last week. Site conditions, which is going to be, again, your soil quality, full sun, and good drainage. We've already hit on those. Site size, of course, smaller areas, you're probably going to want to look at those day neutral or Everbears, again, just because of the running system. The time to manage, matted row is often going to require more management, but typically, if you do it right and you're renovating every year like you should be, and when I say renovate and think pruning apple trees, it's the same thing. We just use a different terminology here. So when we're heavily renovating those strawberries each year, and actually the heavier we do that, the better that crop is going to produce and the longer it's going to last. But you are going to have some management time there for that matted row system. And then, of course, the cost of buying plants every year is going to be a little bit more costly if you go that way. And when we talk about buying plants, I'm one of those weird geeks, you know, no matter where I purchase plants, I'm going to be the one taking it out of a pot. I'm looking at the roots. I want to make sure I've got white roots that are healthy. I don't want anything that's brown and slimy. So when you're purchasing plants, don't be embarrassed to do that, because, you know, you're taking that home. You don't want to be introducing any kind of disease into, you know, into your entire garden. You don't want to start out with a diseased plant because that's just going to be more stress on you and the plant, which is going to cost you more money and cost the plant to get stunted or maybe even die. So always make sure you're inspecting those plants for any kind of root rots, any kind of disease on the leaves. Look for insect damage. Get really personal and intimate with those plants before you purchase. Strawberries are one that you're going to want to order early just to be able to get that good selection of all those cultivars we talked about. Bare roots typically are what we recommend. Those are going to be shipped dormant, so you're going to be planting those now. You can purchase plugs, a variety of locations around here. Broyles here in town I know sells strawberry plugs, but any local hardware store, greenhouse, local greenhouse is going to have those for sale. But typically you're going to wait till fall to plant those. Now, as far as the matted row, you've heard me talking a lot about that. So this is typically what we do in a home garden situation. If we're not growing in raised beds or in containers, and in a home garden setting, this is typically what we're going to refer to as this matted row culture. So you're going to have about a year before those berries are going to bear. The expected life of that planting is 3 to 4. But again, if you're managing that renovation each year, I've known people that can go up to 7 or 8 years on one crop. You're going to plant these in spring, and then you're going to harvest the next spring. And then you'll notice there that 25 plants are going to give you about 40 pounds of fruit in a year. And this is going to be those short day varieties like Early Glow, Jewel, Cardinal, and All Star. So you can always refer back to those cultivar sheets to see the notes on each one of those. But this is what that's going to look like. Of course, this is probably bigger than a lot of our backyards, but it gives you an idea of what that matted row system looks like. If you're OCD, it's going to drive you crazy, but we'll talk about renovation in a few minutes and how you remedy that situation. Site preparation, of course, weed control is going to be critical because we're going in with a small plant to start with, so we don't want to be giving it any kind of competition. We want to make sure that that site bed is completely clean and free of weeds as much as possible. Again, don't follow vegetables just because of some of those disease issues. You want to prep that ground as quickly as you can, as temperatures and the moisture allows. And then you're going to broadcast that complete fertilizer before you plant. That's one of the things with strawberries you really want to get in the habit of doing, is making sure you do that broadcast application. And here's that schematic that I was telling you about a few minutes ago, the correct depth to plant a strawberry, because oftentimes we'll have folks come in with diseases or issues with their strawberry plants, and we can usually track that back to it being an issue with the depth as to which they planted. So if they get it too deep, well, you can see that crown's planted way too deep, and then the one next to it, well, of course, any bit of wind like what we've experienced the last couple of days would just knock that right over. And then you'll notice that last one there on poor root placement. If we don't fluff those roots out, and you hear me speak to that quite a bit in many classes, you want to start those roots off in the right direction. You don't want to just take that plant and just set it in the ground. Make sure you fluff it, and that's just going to encourage it to stretch those roots out and keep growing. Bare root dormant plants can be stored in a refrigerator for about 1 to 2 weeks. So when you're ordering these, make sure that you're timing that accordingly. And then before you plant, make sure you place them in water for about an hour. And anything that you're planting, grapevines or anything like that, apple trees, anything that's bare root, you always want to do that. It just kind of helps open that xylem, I guess, in the plant. It's going to help those root hairs take that material, translocate that water up into the plant a little bit better. And then water in immediately. Don't forget to do that, because that's one reason we're pre-watering those roots. And so watering them in, that just, again, encourages those roots to move toward the water. And you can see what that looks like after freshly being planted in a matted row system. And you heard me say this a minute ago about doing that broadcast application of fertilizer. Make sure that you do that before planting, and then you're going to do it again in June and late August or early September. And you see those rates there. It's about a 1.5 pound of triple 10 per 100 square foot. And you can do the math there to get it accordingly, you know, to whatever size bed that you have. You'll notice there that we did remove the blooms in that first year. It just kind of depends on how you're wanting to do the scale of that planting. You may even need to cut those runners that come out into the aisle that first year. And then, of course, cultural weed control is going to be pretty critical. Our commercial guys are using herbicides, but those are hard to get unless you're a restricted use commercial pesticide applicator. You can apply mulch in the mid to late winter, and typically that'll be just straw is what most folks will use around here. And this is also critical. You want to be able to see some leaves through that mulch, then pull it back and use that mulch to keep that fruit clean throughout the harvest season. That way you're not getting any of that splash up when we have heavy rains like we did last night. And then, of course, you can always go back and add more mulch in between the rows. And you can even actually use mulch. You don't have to use straw because that can get pretty costly. As far as moisture management, drip irrigation can be used. You can actually lay that when you do the planting, but you'll notice here, and Natalie put this in here, consider that as a single season tool because it can get pretty damaged in one season. Overhead irrigation can be good for frost control, but that anytime that we're overhead irrigating anything, it's going to lead to the possibility of disease, especially anthracnose, any of those powdery mildews, molds, root rots, all of those are going to be intensified if we utilize overhead watering. Beds are going to dry out slower, so you don't want to keep too moist for the plants. And then, of course, moist beds are also going to encourage weed growth, so keep that in mind too. Now, as far as the renovation that I've been talking about.
Hey, Melanie,
yeah.
I'm going to ask something. I don't use the 10-10. I try to go organic. What can you use for organic?
Well, I'm not sure. I'll have
Fish oil?
I don't know what
Okay.
the rate would be for that. I'll have to look that up, to be honest. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But you can do any figure and whatever, as long as you're still hitting that MPK ratio and you know
Right.
what your source is, you can do the math on that.
Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
so on renovation, what is that? You've heard me talking a lot about that. That's just removing those old plants, and we're going to let those younger daughter plants grow and produce on their own. And why do we do that? That's just supporting the production, and hopefully we can do that more long term. And you're going to do this every year after harvest. How do we do that? So let's see, I think there's a picture, let me see on this next one. Yeah, okay, so if the foliage is dense or diseased, then you can clip or just mow. You can actually mow right over that row. You can straddle those matted rows. You just don't want to get down there too low and damage that crown. So you might want to practice a little bit with the mower to make sure you're not scalping the plant. But you can actually just go through there and do it with the mower. You can, again, broadcast that complete fertilizer. But if you are spreading, well, you will be spreading fertilizer at that time. Just make sure, take an old broom and dust off anything that gets on the leaves of those when you do that, because you don't want to burn those strawberries back. Nitrogen burn can almost look like anthracnose, but it can stunt the plant back if we leave it on the foliage. If you've got narrow rows, you can go in and use a rototiller, or you can do a combination of both. Use the lawnmower, then go back with the rototiller, and that's just going to help cut that alleyway. And it's not going to be detrimental to the plant at all. The only time you're going to be detrimental to that plant is if you scalp that crown. So again, if you're putting a couple of rows in your garden, I mean, to me, it's just another one of those garden chores we do this time of year. You can just go out there when you're tilling up the cover crop and just run through. Well, you're going to do this later than you would the cover crop, but you know, you've got a tiller handy. Just run that through there, run your mower over it, and get your fertilizer on, and you're pretty well complete with your renovation. And you can kind of see there the plant before you thin it out and then after you thin it out. So that's how much those plants are going to grow in a year. So we don't want to keep allowing that to happen, because if we keep letting them grow, the foliage grow every year, then we're going to lose yield and fruit. So keep that in mind. If you don't go through and renovate every year, then you're going to lose a lot of fruit production. And this just gives you a timeline for that matted row system. For those short day varieties, you can kind of see what you need to be doing when throughout the season. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. I'll just leave that in there as a tool, as a guide for you. When you're growing the day neutral or the everbearing on matted row, you're going to plant those plants closer. You can actually go 5 to 10 inches in the row, because remember, you're going to have fewer runners. You're going to remove those runners the first season, and then you're going to have fruit in the first few weeks. So mulching, again, is going to be critical, because it's going to help moderate those soil temperatures. But in the summertime, you're going to have to come back with another application of nitrogen. Typically, day neutral or everbears, if you're growing matted row, utilizing that system, they say 2 to 3 years. But again, if you're doing heavy maintenance and you're keeping up with your fertility levels and you've got good soil, you've got a good organic matter content, you've got good drainage to start with, you can pull a crop, you know, you can extend that out 4 or 5 years, or maybe even longer. So how many times you renovate is going to depend on the health. It may be only once, or you could be doing it for 2 picking season. It just kind of depends. You can renovate twice for a total of 3 picking season. This is if we're going back to that the June bears. But when you are doing plantings, always purchase new plants. It's kind of like we say with seed potatoes. You don't want to just be cutting up seed potatoes out of your potato bin in the house that come from the grocery store. Make sure you always are buying certified seed. It's kind of the same thing here. That way we know we're not introducing any kind of disease issues. In warmer locations, anthracnose does become an issue with strawberries, no matter what kind they are. So keep that in mind. Actually, pretty much any disease is going to be an issue with strawberries, just because of our spring weather conditions here in East Tennessee. So it's just something to be vigilant about, always scouting your fields and kind of knowing what to look for. And then, you know, try to be as proactive as you can, just being, you know, adhering to some of those cultural mechanisms to keep the strawberries clean and free of weeds and that kind of thing. When we talk about plasticulture systems, this is when, again, we're going back to the Nolichucky River, so you'll kind of know what I'm talking about there. But these are, they're installing new plants every single year, and typically that's going to be in the fall, because we want to do it late enough so we're not encouraging any kind of runner growth on those plants. But you'll notice there that you're going to incur a lot of cost if you go to that plasticulture system, because you've got the plastic mulch, you've got the irrigation, you've got the covers, because with the plasticulture system, you've got to have the irrigation to go along with that. You can't have one without the other to be successful. You are going to get a little bit of a higher yield, but you know, it's like we always say in agriculture, we're always sacrificing one thing for another. So do we want to sacrifice yield for better flavor and a longer period of growth, you know, for the long term?
Melody?
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. Can you talk about container fertilizer? And Tina, what do you mean by that?
Okay, what do I mean by what, Tina? Which one?
Tina asked if you've talked about container fertilizer.
Yep, I'm container gardening. So I have all my plants in containers, even my strawberries. So how do I fertilize that?
You would use that 10-10, but actually that's a good point. I have got a table that breaks it down from 100 square foot, that breaks it down to smaller areas to like 1 teaspoon. And I don't think I have that in here, but that's a good point. So I will include that, but you just refer to that chart. So like if it gives it to you 100 square foot, then just break it down to you know, whatever that may be, 10 square foot, 5 square foot. It's a chart that'll give you how much you need to use. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Thank you, Melody.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm going to add that because I don't have that in that Google Drive. So let me just make myself a note of that. That's a good question, Tina. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for answering.
Okay. Let's see here. I think I went through all that, but that's, you kind of see the difference. This would be what a commercial field looks like versus that matted row system I showed you a minute ago. This is a little bit neater. It is heeled up. They're using the plastic mulch layer that's got the drip included in it. So it does keep it neater. But then at the end of the year, after 1 year, they're going to go through and, you know, pull every bit of that up and start fresh in the fall. So again, if we're going with that matted row, you're going to pull a longer production period. It's just going to be a little bit more work, which to me, doing this plasticulture is more work. But again, it just kind of depends on how you're growing. Let's see, as far as that site preparation, you know, for the plasticulture, again, you can have that spring and summer crop. You got to work that soil later in the summer and then get that soil tested and amended as you need to, and those beds are going to be made in August. And then you'll just kind of see there how the layout of that would be. I don't think most of you all are going to be doing that plasticulture system with the June bears, but if you do, you have that here for a reference. And you see there that mulching again, that plastic mulch, it is going to be costly. It's a costly investment, and you really need a mulch layer because it's a bear if you're trying to do all that by hand. And you'll notice here too, increased growth, especially with black fabric. This is, you know, sometimes we discourage you using the black because it can warm up, it can get too hot, but for strawberries, we've actually seen that it can increase those yields and actually maintain a more uniform temperature. So this would be the one crop that we would say that you could go that route and it would be okay to do that. And I've actually showed you this before with the matted row. You're going to plant the same way for the plasticulture, and again, you can kind of see how that looks. And even though this is a plasticulture system, you can see the mulching that they've gone back and added, and you can do that even with that matted row system. This is a good picture to show that. Or you can just use traditional mulch, but this is probably just a remnant of what they've used to cover that in the springtime, maybe for those early season buds. And then of course for that plasticulture, you may need that overhead available. Sometimes you'll see that going this time of year just for that frost protection, because that's pretty cool. Strawberry blooms can actually withstand, it's a weird number, don't quote me on this, but it's like 28.3 degrees. It's very specific as to the temperature, what it can withstand before you need that frost protection. So those commercial growers have that irrigation set for when they know what that temperature is going to be and when, and they can freeze that berry, and that holds that heat in and allows that fruit to later produce. And just some, I'm gonna have to turn that off. That is just beeping like crazy. I'm sorry. Should have done that before. Just some final notes on plasticulture. They are going to bloom earlier than those matted row systems, so you got to watch for that spring frost. Keep your row covers handy. Irrigation if you're going large scale. Some growers will keep over for a second year. If you are using a row cover, use that woven like the old remade that they use for tobacco beds. And then notice there in the second spring, you're going to have smaller fruit. But again, I don't think many home gardeners are going to use the plasticulture, even in, I mean, it's just a lot to get that established. So as far as matted row, it is going to be less expensive. You're going to have several varieties that are going to be available to you as a bare root. And those are the short day or the day neutral or the Everbears. And you're going to be able to produce those over a longer period of time for several seasons. You are going to have to do that renovation every year. Some people don't like that, but just remember it's pretty easy. Just going through there and mowing them, maybe tilling up the sides. You just don't want to disturb that crown again. But when you're doing this, you're also helping manage weeds, especially if you go back in there and do that mulch cover, even in your alleyways after you do that renovation. And of course, disease can be an issue too with that. As far as plasticulture, these are going to be your higher yielders. They're going to be bigger berries. You're going to have lower pest and disease pressure. These are what's going to come to you in plugs rather than bare root, which is another reason they're going to be more expensive, and you're going to have to deal with all that winter management. So here's the pyramid, Jenny, and it's going to tell you how you can plant that based on spacing, how many plants you need, and it's going to show you the 3 different types there, the June Bear, Everbearing, and the Day Neutral. So that kind of gives you an idea of how to do this. And again, strawberries, well, this next one here, container, you can grow these anywhere. Buckets, gutters, I mean, you can just grow strawberries everywhere. They're just so shallow rooted. You can see from that schematic a few minutes ago too. So even if they've got that long root system, by the time you fluff it out and plant them in a gutter, I mean, that's what they do anyway. That's how those roots end up growing underground. They're not going to go deep like a lot of our other garden plants like tomatoes and peppers. You know, they're not going to put that huge taproot down. They're going to grow on top of the ground like that. But container growing, again, see, that just makes me hungry, those little tiny berries. I'm very prejudiced. I prefer the Everbears and the Day Neutral. I'll just go ahead and tell y'all. Them big old berries, they just lose a lot of flavor in my opinion. But anyway, that's just Melody's side note for the day. But they're going to be a smaller berry, and you see how many more berries there actually are. On one of the short day, you'll typically have like 2 berries clustered there together rather than what, 6 or 7 or 8. These are going to be more for your grazers and freezing and making jam. And again, you're going to get that fruit in the first year. Make sure though, if you're in containers, raised beds to make sure you've got full sun. That's what's going to really yield that flavor and help reduce the disease. Moisture is going to be critical too in those containers, just because we want it just moist enough, you know, to keep that plant viable, but we don't want, you know, to leave water standing, because that's where we're going to incur a lot of those root rots, because no matter where you plant a strawberry, they're not going to appreciate a lot of water. And they are going to require a little bit of nitrogen. Typically, that's another thing you've heard me harp on time and time again, is that we don't want to push a lot of nitrogen because we get all that foliage and we lose fruit. Especially with tomatoes, or like if we have hot compost that we're fertilizing with or building our raised beds with, if it's hot and all that nitrogen, it'll really send that flush of vegetation out, but then we don't have any fruit. Strawberries are just a little bit different. So we, you know, from start to finish, we're going to think about strawberries just a little different than we do anything else really growing in our garden, because they are going to have that high nitrogen content. So nitrogen fertility is going to be very critical for strawberries, more so than anything else that we're growing. Harvesting, they're going to ripen about 30 days after they bloom. That's why people get so excited when they see that bloom first set, because they know it's just a few days and they're going to be eating fresh fruit. You do want to wait till after that fruit's dried before you pick. Again, that's just disease issues, and don't leave them picking out there. I guess I was in Florida visiting Dad a couple years ago, and they were, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's just me, I noticed things like that, but there was a farm that we drove by, and there was just buckets lined up on the side of the field, and it's on up in the morning, and they were just leaving them sitting out there, and it's like, oh my goodness, I don't know if they like were just getting ready to deliver or what, but you don't want to leave them sitting out in the sun. You want to hurry up and get those in a cool location. Typically want to jerk the temperature down to about 33 degrees if you're going to hang on to them and not eat them immediately. So keep that in mind after you pick.
Melody?
Yes.
Why, and I'm prejudiced with Florida strawberries, because to me, and I lived there for a couple of years, they have no flavor. Why is that? Because they're grown in sand versus, you know, Driscoll's in California?
Well, it could be because it's just like a Vidalia onion. I mean, they prefer that sweet soil. So, or think wine grapes, because the soil is going to dictate flavor a lot of times. But yeah, you're right. My dad's down there close to Tampa, and a strawberry down
Cat City.
there, it doesn't taste the same.
No,
Even those big ones up here, you know, that are coming off the river, taste better than what they're picking down there.
exactly.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what that's all about. But yeah, I'd say that has a lot to do with it. Okay. Depending on where you're at, birds could be an issue. So just like with blueberries or anything else that we're using netting for, this may be an issue for you. So you might want to invest in some of that black bird netting. You can kind of see that here, the row cover hoops. Some people will utilize that and just keep those covers on and use that as a netting, plus that frost protection too. So it's double bang for your buck. But whatever works. Sometimes birds may not be an issue. As far as fruit quality, just again, protecting that fruit from the ground. Think back again the last 24 hours. If we had strawberry fruit producing, if we had those fruit on bare ground, just imagine what that fruit would look like, maybe not today, but tomorrow or the next day. We're going to have a lot of disease. We're going to see a lot of disease because of that. So if we can just provide that buffer, and this is not just with strawberries, this is with anything, we're reducing that splash, that soil to splash contact. And that's really going to help us cut down on disease. Make sure you're picking at the proper time. We don't want to leave fruit on there to over ripen, because again, that's going to draw in pathogens. That's going to bring in insects. We don't want to be encouraging any of that kind of occurrences. Plus, with that spotted wing Drosophila fly, folks say that, you know, strawberries, they don't bother the strawberries because it's an early crop, but we have seen an uptick in the spotted wing, even here in Northeast Tennessee. Most of the time we think that's due to letting the fruit linger, it being too ripe, letting it linger on the vine for too long. So when that fruit's ready to pick, go ahead and pick it, and it's just going to be less work on yourself in the long run. Rapid cooling, do that again too. I kind of like them when they're warm myself, but you can't eat a 5-gallon bucket of strawberries in one sitting. If you can, you're more of a woman than I am. But make sure you get those cooled down pretty quick. All right, so for some of you, this is going to be just a refresher from last week, but I think it's important that we hit on these again, because if you're going to grow strawberries, you're going to probably see these things. So the more we can acquaint ourselves with these diseases, the better off we're going to be, especially when we're operating under the umbrella that we are now. It's harder to get diagnosis for some of these things, and takes a little bit longer time to get things to the lab if we don't know what that stuff is. And when we're not operating in the office, it's hard for us to scope some of these things. So anytime we can be proactive, that's going to be better. So here is anthracnose. You've heard me already mention this tonight. This is one that we're going to see frequently in strawberry fields, whether we're growing in those containers, Tina, we see this quite frequently, or in raised beds, any kind of medium that we're growing it in, you're gonna see this issue. Some of that fruit can be salvaged. This fruit is completely involved, but sometimes you can catch it early and still salvage some for jams and jellies. But what happens is that once that infects that fruit, then it can serve as a point of infection for nearby fruit as well. And this just kind of shows you another picture there, what that's going to look like, those little soft spots. It is going to be more of an issue when we have those warm, moist conditions during harvest. It's, again, can affect all parts of the fruit or of the plant. If we're mulching, that's going to help decrease this occurrence, making sure that we've got clean plants, and fungicides sometimes are going to need to be utilized. This is that red steel disease, that root rot that you've heard me refer to frequently. I don't know if you can see the misshapen plants here, or just the size variance. Those plants should be much larger. They should be about this size. Typically when we see that in a field, that's the first thing we think about. It's either red steel or verticillium. But you can kind of see what those roots are going to look like. They're kind of going to be scarred. They're not going to be really fleshy and friable like we like we want to see them. That is a soil fungus, so once we have that, it's there. It's kind of like the southern blight in tomatoes and peppers. Usually you'll start out with that stunting, but then they'll start wilting back, and death 9 times out of 10 is going to occur because of this. Notice that third bullet. It's going to be most serious in moist, cool, heavy soils. And what do we have going on in Northeast Tennessee? All of those, typically. So it's really a major issue for us here. That's another reason we really push those cultivars with resistance to red steel. Leather rot or crown rot. This one is another water mold. It looks very similar to anthracnose. Can't almost tell the difference unless we're scoping that to be able to really tell what that causal organism is. Sometimes you will hear us, I know some of you are from other counties, sometimes some of us will refer to it as leather rot, some of us will call it crown rot, some of us will just call it Phytophthora. I typically call it Phytophthora because just with that background, I want to know what I'm dealing with. But you've heard Phytophthora in other crops too, so it doesn't just affect strawberries. It's something. It's not going to be contagious from one crop to the other, but it's something that we see quite frequently in many crops throughout the growing season. This is that gray mold. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And of course, again, that serves as a source of infection, and that's just going to keep spreading. Botrytis is that gray fuzzy growth that we see. This one's pretty prevalent, but air circulation and good sanitation is really going to help with that. So you'll notice, hopefully, from these past few slides, again, why renovation is so critical in strawberries. Because when we go through there and we're reducing the size of that row down, then we're also reducing or increasing that air circulation. We're reducing that mass, and we're getting rid of a lot of potential for disease, and anything that could be harbored there, we're getting rid of some of that point of where the pathogen can enter the plant. So as far as disease management, what are some things we can do? It's going to depend on what pathogens are present. But if we're maintaining adequate plant spacing and row spacing, that's going to encourage, again, that good sunlight penetration. We're going to have good air circulation throughout that strawberry patch. So that's the 2 key things we're really aiming for. Be able to control those weeds. Start with a stale seed bed. Make sure that it's good and clean, free of weeds. Go through there with a hoe a couple times a year, as those strawberries are just getting established, and make sure you keep that area clean. Use that straw mulch to reduce that soil contact, again, and soil splash. And then you'll notice there, preventative fungicides are usually not needed here in East Tennessee. We don't recommend that, but as long as you're scouting your plants and applying those fungicides on an as-needed basis. And even when we do get some instances or occurrences of anthracnose or botrytis, any of those rots, if we catch that early enough and can do some cultural things, often we don't need to spray a fungicide. But if we let it manifest itself for too long, or if we get into a situation, again, with the weather we've had the last couple of days, it can become a major issue, and oftentimes we're going to have to use a fungicide. And of course, I'm going to attach, I think that's already in the Google Drive for you anyway. But I was going to say something about that too. Scouting, and I don't know, I'll come back to it. It'll hit me in a few minutes. And of course, I showed you this last week, the spotted wing. You'll see there that, where are strawberries? Yeah, up here with muscadines and grapes. It pretty much, we used to say strawberries weren't going to be infected or weren't going to be an issue with spotted wing, but we're starting to see a higher occurrence of that. So again, just be cautious, be aware of that. We don't like to be spraying our strawberries with insecticide. And again, I think if you're just picking at the right interval, then that's going to really discourage that pest from being a major problem. Okay, so that was really quick, but I didn't want to keep y'all on here for like 2 hours like we've been doing. So pretty quick, move through that. Do y'all have any more questions?